Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Neelofer Qadir, and I'm an assistant professor in International and Global Studies and English. And joining me today are three students from my English 431 Feminist Theory and Women Writers course, Rejani King, Maya C. Gray, and Marlas Y. Whitley. I'm really delighted to have them present their work from that class on the panel today. So what we will do is I will introduce them very briefly right before they give their talk. So each person's talk is about 10 to 12 minutes long, and I'll introduce them. Feel free to ask questions using the question and answers feature, which is available hopefully on the bottom of your screen. We will take all questions together at the end, but I invite you to submit them as the participants are speaking or any comments that you might have for them as well. They'll be able to see them and we'll take them up all together at the end. I also want to thank the Program of African American and African Diaspora Studies for creating this really wonderful conference. We're so lucky to be participating, and also thank all of our attendees that include faculty from all over UNCG, as well as students from my current undergrad class, Literature of the Oceans, and my grad class, Oceanic Humanities, who have come out to support their classmates. So without further ado, let me begin by introducing Rejani King. Rejani is an undergraduate student and McNair Research Scholar at UNC Greensboro, majoring in women's gender and sexuality studies. Rejani's areas of interest bridge speculative fiction and voice with Black women writers' takes on identity, surrogacy, and Black feminist theory. Specifically, stories theorizing the experiences of Black people, Black futures, and time. Rejani, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Qadir. So my presentation is on spectral presences, and this is a critical analysis of the dragonfly sea. And so with spectral presences such as ghosts, jinns, or specters, they can often seem unreal or beyond human understanding, but they continue to show themselves in the deepest, most personal and intricate parts of a person's life. And so these can often be seen as extensions of trauma. They can be seen as protective. In particular moments lead and guide to provide a sense of awareness. And so we can see this through warnings and be a possible way of searching for answers. And so for the Dragonfly Sea, that's written by Yvonne spectral presences permeate the lives of those on Pate, the Swahili seas, through operating as a bridge between the dead and living by way of memory, their connections to the sea, and through a feminist standpoint of haunting that represents movement and gender and power dynamics of the past and the present. And so with spectral presences operating as bridges between the dead and living through memory and serving as a guide to facing as well as grappling with this grief. Awar's The Dragonfly Sea is a coming of age story, and the story follows Ayada, who is of Kenyan and Chinese descent on the island of Pate, and on her journey studying in China as the descendant. And through this time, she encounters love, she encounters history, language, grief, and navigating womanhood, among other themes. And so throughout this text, there are references to ghosts and jinns who remain a constant part of her story as she navigates the seas and experiences she faces. And an early mention of jinns in this text comes from the perspective of the man Ayana adopts as her father, who is Muhyiddin. And he has returned to Pate from being at sea and is awakened one night to a ghost in the water. And so in the text, it says, he had noticed the glimmer of light in the magenta slashing across the sky. In that luster, he had glimpsed a being leaping in the ocean, cavorting like a baby pombu, a dolphin. And so here Muhyiddin characterizes this being as a jinn, but further along into the passage, he shares the possibility of yearning for ghosts and thinking the being he saw is Ayana. And so he also says he knew how the sea was with certain people, how it needed them, and they it. It was like that for him, but it had been expected of him. And this particular scene of the text sets up what I believe not only to be a description of Muhyiddin's connection with the sea, but a basis for Ayana's relationship with the sea and what and whom it carries as well. And so Muhyiddin also, he states that his father and grandfather were sea keepers. And I believe here this connects with the idea of Ayana also being a bridge between these cultures, these worlds, these languages and histories, and also communities. And with the Dragonfly Sea being a coming of age story told from an omniscient narrator's perspective that focuses on Ayana specifically, I believe this coincides with the feminist standpoint I'm arguing also, that centers a female character, which allows us to think about gender and expectations women are expected to have as far as their positionality in their respective societies, and of movements surrounding gender and power dynamics from a cultural perspective. And so Ayana being characterized as a jinn, I found that really interesting because in the text, ghosts are also described as shadows. And I believe Ayana being a jinn represents, these certain histories, stories, and events of the past and present, as well as economical, social, cultural, and political aspects between China and Kenya that allow us to observe how her embodiment of expression of herself carries these. And so there are distinctions between these jinns and ghosts, with jinns specifically being thought of as invisible spirits and ghosts being typically seen physically, like with the human eye. And here I use jinn and ghosts interchangeably because based on various cultures and their definitions, ghosts can also take the forms of jinn. So this is to not generalize those two terms. Um, the connection between ghosts and jinns regarding the sea is rooted in the idea of a body of water having the power to give life and also take it. And for regions like the island of Pate on the Swahili Seas, um, there that ocean is a part of, well, a point of departure and return regarding migration. And so in the Dragonfly Sea, a defining moment where Ayana references ghosts comes from a passage of being with Kure, who is also studying in China with her in Istanbul. So she witnesses the mistake of traveling with him unfold and having a constant feeling of missing home. And the text states, Ayana thought, today, my ghosts, you have witnessed my tumble, transmutation, what she knew currents were bearers of destinations. And here she's implying that her ghosts have changed form. They have become like the water or the air that carries, in this case, her home on Pate, which has become an avenue of protection. And so the ghosts carry her memories of home, travels, and people she has encountered, as well as her connection to the sea. She is constantly being made aware of throughout the text and grieves as she is away. And from a feminist standpoint, the presence and roles of ghosts and jinns in the Dragonfly Sea operate through haunting women that represents movement and gender and power dynamics of the past and present. So Awar's choice to focus on Ayana and the role of ghosts in the text itself presents itself as a way of conceptualizing gender and the positions women are expected to hold, specifically in the context of Kenya and China, but also globally, such as the expectations of marriage and having children. So on Ayana's journey to China, she's on a ship and it's damaged by severe weather. And the text says, a storm battered ship, dents broken, components straining metal, the silence of threatened humans, memory as a telescope in the flotsam of the sea, assorted metaphors to explain the debris of human breaking, of human changing. And so there are repeated references to silence and waiting and the topic of the quote unquote unseen or invisible, which are all characteristics of these ghosts, as well as reference aspects of social expectations of women. And so I think the relationship between storms, social expectations, or these quote unquote norms and spectral presences is that women are being haunted by social expectations. They're carrying the position of being a specter that reveals and uncovers these harmful expectations and seeks to kind of uncover, to uncover those harmful expectations, but also expose them. And I think the storm is a representation of this practice. And so these ghosts seem familiar to the characters in the text, in whom they are in contact with, and characterized as shadows and or memories of people and things of the past. And these ghosts and specters bear witness to experiences and events. And they're also seen as a force of power connecting past and present histories of war and language and migration that are common themes within this text as well. And it's also where interactions of the ghosts between the characters also serve as a way of shifting and changing how they see their environment and others, as these jinns or these ghosts often present themselves in very defining moments for these characters, specifically with Ayana. And so these ghosts and jinns are familiar. They're characterized as sacred, and they're connected to Ayana as she navigates the grief of her home, of having to leave. And in the story, leave her mom, but also she leaves behind on Pate, Muhyiddin, her adopted father as well. So um, these spectral presences, the ghosts, the jinns, specters, permeate the lives of those on Pate, the Swahili seas, through operating as this bridge between the dead and living by way of memory, their connections to the sea, and through this feminist standpoint that I've argued of haunting and that represents movement and gender and power dynamics of the past and present. And so for Owar, there are references to these ghosts and jinns throughout the text that remain this constant aspect of Ayana's life, and as she navigates these different environments that she's in and the people she encounters on her journeys. And so this text explores an idea of a haunting that works alongside the realities of immigration through oceanic travel, grief by way of loss and memory, and a feminist viewpoint of gender and power relationships. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rejani, for a really lovely paper. You've given us a lot to think with, and I invite people who are in the audience to extend comments and questions for Rejani into the Q&A if they'd like. Next, we will have Maya C. Gray. Maya is a senior at UNC Greensboro, where she's pursuing her BA in African American and African Diaspora Studies with a double minor in English and Women and Gender Studies. After graduation, Maya plans to attend law school to pursue a Juris Doctor degree.
Thank you, Dr. Qadir. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you all. Nope. Okay. Can everybody see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it.
Cool. Awesome. So good evening, everyone. My name is Maya C. Gray, and the title of my presentation is called The Complexions of Water, Analyzing the Relationship Between the Ocean and Black Bodies. So because of the theme of CACE, I wanted to first consider the Black female suffering, initially with the concept of Sylvia Hartman's critical population theory, and then Christina Sharp's the wake concept. And then following that, I will be looking at M. Norbise Phillips' Zong's poem. And then after that, I'll look at Atlantis, which is a Netflix film directed by Mati Diop. So first, I want to look at
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to make sure that we all get to hear your amazing presentation. The mic may just be getting rubbed on something. It's like, it's coming in a little distorted, but it just sounds like something may just be rubbing it.
No problem.
Yep,
Does
no
that sound
problem.
better?
There you go. Continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to start off with Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation theory. Well, and I was first introduced this by her text or her work, Venus in Two Acts, where she attempts to complete the narrative of an enslaved African girl held captive during the transatlantic slave trade. And why she does this is because historical narratives fail to represent the whole narrative of this enslaved African girl. And because of this, Hartman said that the historical narratives called her a dead girl. And so Hartman gives her the name of Venus. So I think Hartman's doing a form of justice, giving rise to the many missing and unknown hidden narratives of African female girls who were held captive during the transatlantic slave trade and who were abused and discarded by the ocean. And then shifting to Christina Sharp's work in The Wake on Blackness and Being, I was fascinated by her definition of the wake, which is grief, celebration, memory, and those among the living who, through ritual, mourn their past and celebrate their lives. So I believe, or I propose that Hartman's critical fabulation theory is a way of raising the wake of Black female suffering during the transatlantic slave trade. So moving on to Philip's work of Zong. So Zong is a book-long prose poem, non-traditional prose poem, detailing the Zong massacre of 1781, which was a killing and brutal murdering of approximately 150 enslaved African captives on the Zong ship by British crew members. And she only uses the words from the legal case Gregson v. Gilbert. And I also wanted to show you guys how she phrases these words and these concepts in her book. And particularly, I want to look at the section sal, meaning salt. So for example, you can see the distortion of words and phrases across the pages, right? And so we can look at, she uses words and phrases like in Negro's murder, from captain, within ashes, and rob her, and so on and so forth. And so I believe that if you try to connect the dots, I say, or connect the words and phrases, you may be able to get an image. If you're unable to get an image, you can kind of see the words swaying and shifting from like left and right. And so my idea is that this swaying and shifting motion is the sorry, my mind thought is the enslaved captives drowning and being discarded by the ocean. So that's what I was thinking when I saw this text. And I also want to look at, towards the back of the book, she has a section called Women Who Wait. And so I think that this is a section where women who probably were enslaved African female captives would stand by male British crew members and wait to be sexually assaulted or sexually exploited. And so again, we have Philip's work bringing back the surface of the enslaved female captives, or just African captives in general, who would witness the transatlantic slave trade. So I thought those works were pretty interesting. So now I will go into Atlantics. So Atlantics is a Netflix film directed by Mati Diop, and it is basically about a young man named Solomon who seeks the sea in search to reach, or anticipating to reach, Spain from Senegal, along with his crew members. And unfortunately, they don't make it to Spain. So they come back to surface to haunt or possess the women who are left at shore. And so I did want to play like a small quick clip of the film, detailing the horrors the tragedies and the feelings that were witnessed during their transit.
ñii di jooy ndax tiit ak jaxasoo li ma séenoo jàpp di ab tund la nekkate maru géej la lu rëy mu yëkkati suñu gaal ba ci kaw tas ko màbb ci suuf.
So a couple of things here. So for one, the reason why Solomon and his co-workers were looking at Spain was to leave their present situation, which was they were experiencing labor exploitation in their home. More specifically, in the movie, they said that they were withheld paychecks, 3 going on 4 months. And so Spain looked like a good opportunity to reap economic gain or relieve them from their financial hardship. However, because of this hope and desperation, or we can categorize it as Black suffering, they were blinded by the perils that lie from the ocean. And so we can also look at this in a socio-political lens where economically deprived Black people have no other choice but to leave their realms or their situation, and leave their home in search for economic opportunity. But in this case, they were robbed by false hope. And so I believe that Black life is unforeseeable, and the underlying factors of oppression, in this case, financial hardship, contributes to its unpredictability. And in many instances, we hear stories of people migrating from one destination to another, but sometimes we fail to acknowledge those who don't make it to their destination, right? Especially going via the sea or the ocean. And so I believe I'm connecting Atlantics and Zong because I believe that their suffering may not be as cruel and as brutal and tragic as the Zong massacre, but there is a commonality between the two, which is the ocean is acting as a burial site or as a grave site for deceased Black bodies, while simultaneously we have this umbrella of Black death being predictable and inescapable. And so in conclusion, as I was doing my research, I was trying to find like a common thread between everything. And so like the common thread that I thought of was Black disposability, which is like you can dispose Black bodies, but you can't completely erase the evidence. Like the evidence will come back to light, or will come back to the present, or will come back to haunt us, right? And so I definitely think that looking at Zong and Atlantis, we get to see a global view of the complexities and intricacies of Black suffering and of Black death. And so I definitely think there needs to be a little bit more research, maybe a little more fleshing out of these concepts, but I think I did a good job just putting this into light. So thank you for my presentation.
Thank you, Maya. That's a really sharp connection between Phillips, Zong, and Atlantics. And now for our third speaker, Marlas Yvonne Whitley, who's a senior at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she's pursuing a bachelor's in English studies with a minor in communication studies. After graduation, she intends to continue her scholarship of English through postgraduate studies, particularly that which focuses on Black writers and media makers. Marlas.
Hello, all. Thank you so much for coming out in the virtual space to support us and to hear us speak tonight. It is very much an honor to be to even have this opportunity to come before you all. I think the CACE Planning Committee and the faculty members who are involved in coordinating CACE and making this year, especially making space for the acknowledgement of Black women this year. Thank you. Because it was in the very beginning, it was very hard to even think to begin starting my talk. I went an unconventional route and wrote a poem, and this is what I put down on paper, which will then transition into my talk for the evening. The ocean is free, shifting, swelling with emotion severe, tides like tears turbulent as she turns. Currents crest and crash mightily. Her wandering waves welcomes wanderers while keeping secrets, solemn to her own mysteries. She is one with her body, intimate, for the life within teems glorious. She speaks to shores and writes poetry between shorelines, gentle in her truths about pain and misplaced joy. The ocean is free. When I think about liberation, I think about the ocean. She is a body that is thus liberated. The movements and motions of water and are her freedom manifest, expressed in her currents, waves, and whirlpools. Liberation as a practice works in different ways across discourses of race, identities, and cultures. And my own understanding of the concept in the general sense, I put simply that liberation is a practice in pushing back and setting free. Early on, I likened this definition of liberation to the act of exorcism, which in religious contexts is the practice of expelling demons or ghosts, working to free a person or place of the spirit's possession. I talk about this in my final project for feminist theory, where I explore ideologies of power and how, in various ways, they affect or haunt the Black diaspora in the modern. I theorize liberation through the framework of exorcism as a deliberate and forceful act. I then applied this to the film Atlantics, a love story directed by Mati Diop, and one that I highly suggest you screen if you have access to Netflix. As my thinking evolved and continues to evolve beyond this initial idea of how I understand liberation to work, it leads me to notions about the emotionality of the act of setting free and how that drives the practice. Atlantic certainly lends itself into a reading where we analyze and think through this theory. I cannot and will not speak to the nuances of Senegalese cultures, for the film's story takes place in a region of Senegal. So I am careful to dissect the theme of liberation by reading it strictly through the structure or how the characters are structured in relation to each other. So not to undermine or erase cultural discourses. That being said, I am focusing my talk tonight on how Atlantics illustrates the practice of liberation and its emotional aspects relative to the protagonist Ada and her relation to the characters of Suleiman and Omar. I interpret Ada to be a woman caught between the realms of confinement and freedom. She is arranged to marry Omar, a man who comes from substantial wealth, but whom she does not love. Her heart belongs to Suleiman, a construction worker who is just as in love with her. Though she does have a choice in the matter of whether or not to marry Omar, Ada feels obligated to do so because of the financial security it would afford herself and her family, and because she would lose the support of her family if she did not follow through with the arrangement. This can be thought of as confinement in Ada's case. A marriage with several social and financial benefits, yes, but with a person she has no feelings for. As opposed to Omar, Suleiman can be symbolic of freedom because Ada truly loves him and wants to be with him regardless of financial and social class. Because Suleiman's wages for his labor are being unjustly kept from him, he and several other workers take an unauthorized boat to sea in order to immigrate to Spain for better work opportunities. We soon learn that the men go missing at sea, and Ada, in her sadness and solemnness, marries Omar. At her wedding reception, a fire is set ablaze under the suspicion of arson. The fire is significant in that it symbolizes a turning point for our main character. In the beginning, Ada can be interpreted or read as compliant and passive in the steering of her life. The fire heralds an awakening in Ada, and from that we begin to see a shift in her character around the midpoint of the film. She is made confident of Suleiman's return after receiving a mysterious text message. In the following scene, she is wrongfully jailed for refusing to answer questions about who may have set the fire at her reception. Ada is then bailed out by Omar, who expects her to leave with him, but Ada refuses his expectation and ultimately the relationship altogether. We will now watch the scene that I refer to here, and afterwards I will go forward in analyzing it.
Ada lan la dugal ci oto bi ñu dem la ngay def fi
dara
lan moo la dal lan mooy sa problème ah
dara
dafa am lu ñu la def ci biir
déedéet
dafa ñu la dara
kenn defuma dara
waaw looy taxaw fii nag léegi dugal ñu dem yow lan la yow lan mooy sa problème
ànduma ak yow
ana nga dof la mooy ànduma ak yow dafa na nga daanu ci sa bopp dugal ci biir ñu dem waaw nga naan ànduma ak yow kay fi nga
bàyyi ma ko nag ànduma ak yow dama sa yoon bàyyi ma
lu xew waaw looy def fii ba léegi lan mooy demal sa yoon yow sax dof yi mooy lan lan moo la dal dugal ci biir waaye nga naan man ma taxaw fii tel ay wax
bàyyi ma dew ma
kay waxal di yuuxu xanaa nga dof
bàyyi sama loxo
kay waxal di yuuxu
dama yuuxu bàyyi sama
nga
loxo
wax di yuuxu
bàyyi ma
dugal ci oto bi
bàyyi ma nekkatuma sa jabar bàyyi ma
dugal fii nga naan may nekk
bàyyi ma nekkatuma sa jabar
lan
bàyyi sama loxo
barki démb ma takk la tey nga naan nekkatuma sama jabar loolu bëgg dal la
bugguma la bàyyi ma
ba ma bëggul mooy lan
bàyyi ma bugguma la
dafa dof xanaa kaay fii foo jëm dafa dof xanaa demal sa yoon yaay kan yow yow façon yow yëngaloo ma sax yow doo sax jigéen yow demal sa yoon dafa dof.
Thank you, Qadir. So I like this scene and I use it here because it best illustrates Ada making the decision to choose freedom. She is confident that Suleiman is back and thus rejects Omar for the one she truly loves. By doing this, Ada is no longer between confinement and freedom. In her decision, she chooses what she knows is right for herself. Thus, she claims her own agency. This is liberation at work in the text. So, knowing this, in thinking of the emotional functionality of liberation, we can consider love as a motivator or the motivator for Ada. We can also interpret love to take on two functions in this context. Ada's leaving Omar because she loves Suleiman, and Ada's leaving Omar because she loves herself. I believe both aspects of love interpreted here are integral to the work of liberation or a function of liberation in that they impart force as motivation and thus drives practice. We can also think of the emotion of anger in this way, which supplies tenacity and relentlessness in working to obtain freedom. So through analyzing Ada and her relations to Omar and Suleiman, we're given an illustration of liberation and how it functions through the emotional. Thinking about this in a broader sense, I theorize that when faced with ills in regards to the personal or societal, however they are imposed, our emotions become like that of the oceans. And what I mean by this is like the forcefulness and ferocity of the ocean's waters, so do our emotions swell and reach like waves in the midst of a strong storm. Thus, the emotionality of liberation consists of feelings, love and anger aptly made intense in the heat of injustice's fiery sun. These fervent states of such emotions thus drive the various robust and or radical forms of liberation, whether it be for ourselves or our communities. As I move to my conclusion, I want to note some things that have stayed prominent in my mind when shaping my presentation from my final paper, which looks rather different from my final paper. For one, thinking of an aspect of liberation in such a way has certainly helped in conceptualizing liberation in Black feminist thought specifically. Black feminisms, and I place emphasis on the plurality of feminisms, employs liberation not only as a means to free ourselves from the confines of structures used to imprison us in incredible cycles of violence, but to combat those same structures and their insidious snares altogether for the betterment of our communities. The love and anger through which liberation is practiced in Black feminist thought is something on a level all its own. Of course, in thinking through this, my frames of reference are rooted in feminisms of the African American diaspora. Moving forward, I'm expanding my understanding of liberation, emotionality, and the Black woman, learning about and incorporating feminisms of Africa and the global South. As an aspiring academic and Black feminist, it is beneficial to my own thinking and practice. Lastly, I want to note that in Atlantics, the camera focuses on the ocean for extended periods of time. The ocean herself is a character in the film, one that Ada soon becomes. Like the ocean, she becomes liberated. Like the force of the ocean's waters, the strength of her own love achieves this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlas. I really want to congratulate you, Rejani, and Maya for 3 really brilliant papers. At this point, we'd like to invite the audience to ask questions. There are a couple of folks who have posed some comments and ideas in the Q&A already, but we have, let's say, something like 15 good minutes to converse with one another. So I have a bunch of questions, but because I get to interlock with these students all the time, I'll maybe ask you all to see if there are things that you have noticed in each other's work that now feel particularly resonant for you. Things that you are noticing that feel like a connection across the works, or any also like departures that are really salient as well.
I would say for me, when first thinking about what I even wanted to talk about, working from elements of my final paper, I've noticed that, for one, my theorizing of liberation was very underdeveloped in my final project. I focused more on power structures, colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, and how they made ideologies, which I liken to Poltergeist. And I think I was more interested in that aspect and ran with that. So with this talk, trying to figure it out, I was thinking, well, I do talk about liberation and as exorcism. Maybe I should develop this further. And by doing that, I have noticed that the film Atlantics certainly illustrates that more than I had previously thought in my initial viewing of the film. And I would argue that Zong, which is another text that I put in conversation with Atlantics, also does this as well through how M. the Borsay Philip constructs her poems. So certainly going forward, I want to explore more of liberation. And I think that was certainly an element that has made itself prominent to me in the 2 months preparing for tonight.
I do have a couple of questions that I'm going to try to take together. So one of them is an anonymous attendee asking about links in the text and artifacts between the ocean, haunting, and time. And they thank all 3 of you for your amazing presentations. The second question is by Dr. Hewan Gurma, who notes that there's a common theme of haunting and the ocean as a tumultuous space. Can the ocean ever be positive space for Black folks or Black women more specifically? Are there ways that the space of the ocean can be reclaimed?
I know y'all looking at me. I'm thinking. Can the ocean ever be a positive space? I mean, I want to say yes, but I need to elaborate more on that. Because there's so much haunting history behind it. So it's kind of hard for me to think about it in a positive way. I don't know what y'all think, Rejani and Marlas.
I think with, well, across all of the texts that we've kind of brought forth in this presentation, specifically with oceans, haunting, and time, I think like, especially like with Atlantics, we get this visual, very visual sense of the ocean and people, how they react to that, how that is kind of like, it's very centered, you know, around their lives and their environment. And I think it speaks to also like their proximity to that as well and how that influences their lives. And I think especially with haunting in time, I know with the Atlantics, we see a haunting with the possession of women, specifically by these men. And even in Zong, the haunting of, you know, these people who have been thrown into the ocean. And, you know, this always brings me back to Christina Sharp's term of residence time, always, about how, you know, the sea carries these people's bodies and they're never technically gone. Their bodies are decomposing in the ocean. And so with time, I think, especially with how we've conceptualized, I think how we've conceptualized Black trauma and pain and the roots of those historically and how those, like, I think the term is temporalities, but like how you see those throughout time.
Marlis, would you like to add to that a little bit? No pressure though.
Stating the question so I can
Sure.
have a little
Question was about haunting, oceans, and time. And the second question was, is there a way for the ocean to be a positive space for Black folks or Black women more particularly?
So I think the second question, it more so resonates with me is that I do believe that there can be positive space, or the ocean or some aspects of the ocean can be made a positive space. How that is done though, I feel like it's more wow, I thought I had a better answer for you. It's definitely more metaphorical in some ways. Like I think about tides, waves, currents. I think about how the ocean itself, despite all the tragedies that have happened on it and within it, still it's just this mighty force of nature, right? Still it has mighty waves and it crashes upon rocks, and I just think that is amazing. It's kind of in a way the ocean fighting back against these traumas, or in a way coping with these traumas. Um, and honestly, my thinking of the ocean as a character itself helps me to better understand um, just how just how that happens, if that makes sense. It's certainly a question that has, I think, multiple answers. But for me, that's how I do believe that in the ocean's own emotionality, it can be made a positive space.
I remember I said, real quick, I remember I said that the ocean is kind of acts as like a burial site. And you know how sometimes people, I don't do this, but people do this, go to like grave sites, like pay their respects. So maybe the ocean can be like a way of paying one's respect to the many lives that are lost, many lives that are hidden, unknown, etc. So I just thought about that. Marlas made me think of that. And Rejani.
And I think this also, from both of your points, I think it also brings it back to how the ocean has been perceived, and also like how we see those perspectives, whether that's in literature or the news, or just how those spaces have been kind of conceptualized by people. And so with the question of, can the ocean ever be a positive space for Black folks or Black women more specifically, I think that has a lot to do with that. And if this is a space that can be reclaimed, I think that's something that that also has like a lot of complexity with, especially because the ocean I think the ocean can seem like this separate entity that people aren't necessarily, I'm trying to figure out how to really describe this in a way that makes sense, but like thought of in a way that people aren't necessarily inhabiting, but there are people who have been, on these oceans, who have been migrating and transnationally. So
I'll just really quickly say that there's so many good questions. I just took a screenshot of them so I can pass them on to the students later, since we are almost out of time. And I think, like, if I may take the last word, my apologies, is that I think these students and their work and the Black women writers whose work they're drawing from are showing us how Black feminist thought is a reparative relationship to the ocean, right? If we go back to Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, which Maya cited most directly, but Rejani also brought up through the concept of residence time, which is incidentally like the section that Maya showed us from M. Norbese Phillips' song with Saul. And Sharp writes that it's the sodium from the blood of enslaved peoples thrown overboard that is still decomposing in the ocean today because of this term called residence time, the time it takes for different nutrients to fully decompose. And so the time of slavery is not yet over, is something that Sharp and Hartman bring our attention to. And if it's not yet over, then being in the wake is a way of repairing that relationship to the ocean, perhaps, right? And so we're getting that from all of the brilliant people that these students are engaging, but also these students' work. Please join me in applauding them. I will share your questions with them. Congratulations to you all. There is another panel at the conference at 6 o'clock, chaired by Dr. RJ Bautel. If I had the program with me, I would tell you its name, but I have now lost the program in my tabs. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate all of you, and thank you and congratulations to the students.